Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies Podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Alice Lovejoy. I'm a professor at the University of Minnesota.
Prof. L. It's a delight to meet you. It's great to do so. Are you wearing, is that a dress or a top? Is that a blouse? What is that thing?
It's a top. It's a shirt.
It's a great
Yeah,
design. It's sort of
thank you.
floral, but not girly. I mean, it's
Thank you.
more forest. Is the right adjective forestial? I don't know.
Sylvan, I don't know,
Oh,
but
Sylvan, that sounds good.
maybe.
Anyway, it's a great top.
Thank you.
Prof, I wanted to start by inquiring what's currently dynamizing, impeding, interesting, preoccupying you. What's going on for Prof L?
I'd have to say my plum tree. So I
Hmm.
planted a plum tree last year in the front garden, and it gave us one fruit last year, and we have 60 this year. So that seems like a great amount of abundance at a moment when the world is filled with things that are not going so well.
So, am I to assume from this that the plum is very hardy?
Yes, and in your question, I hear that Minnesota is a cold place to live. Yeah, this is a Mount Royal plum, which I think was bred in Canada, in Quebec. So it is suited to the kinds of winters we get here.
Right. And how does it cope with the equally vicious summers with those Minnesotan flies that race towards electronic screens in great numbers?
So far so good. We've lost a few to the birds, but not to the flies yet. So I'm taking it that the birds have a better sense than I do of when a fruit is ready to be picked. So I'm starting to pick them now.
Well, that is exciting. And of course, it's one of those stories that Um, occasionally, the New York Times or the New Yorker will deem somehow or other worthy of writing about that the Nation, Mother Jones, the Atlantic, the New Republic will not. But we've found space for it.
The plums, yes,
I mean,
indeed.
it is incredibly interesting, I think, that notion of, I mean, the importance of, in a sense, as we were saying before we started recording, little things that actually can mean a lot to people. The feeling that they've done something different in terms of the rest of their lives, or different in terms of the space that they're occupying, or what their jobs may be, or whatever. A bit like the way that the hobby is not something the Nation, the Atlantic, the New Republic, Jacobin would write about, but the New Yorker and the New York Times, to their credit, would. You know, these
Yeah,
things that are not huge.
it's
Sorry, go ahead.
it's a oh, sorry about that. It's absorbing, right? I mean, these kinds of things, they grow on their own schedule. Picking them takes their own time. It's,
Yeah.
watching them, evolving on a schedule that's not your own. And I think that that is absorbing.
They're like very slow moving pets.
Yes, exactly. Uh, Probably harder to kill, also, which is an advantage.
Indeed. Now, much as I would like to prove myself to be like the New York Times uh, and the New Yorker, but far to the left of any of the magazines I've mentioned, we're actually here to talk about what is, in fact, a much more interesting topic, which is your new and, frankly, I think, brilliant book called Tales of Militant Chemistry, the Film Factory in a Century of War. Prof. Lovejoy, militant chemistry. Does your inner chemist rebel when you read those words you wrote?
I should say I don't have an inner chemist, but it is a question, and it's been posed about the title, the word militant, whether, what it means in this context. And it is a quote from Primo Levi from the periodic table. But of course, it can be read in two different ways. This is much more a book about the military and chemistry than it is about a kind of militancy that we might think about in terms of oppositional media, oppositional filmmaking, et cetera. It's a very different kind of meaning for the word.
And it's a fascinating tale of corporate capital, state capital, war, death, disaster, much of it in the name of pleasure and
Hmm.
some of it in the name of service. So I wonder if you could outline for us a little bit about that and the the two companies that are operating in parallel across the Atlantic that are very much the focus of the research.
Yes, so the book is a story of film, film stock, the celluloid that we use to make movies or take photographs, or did until film became largely digital, through the lens of the chemical industry. And so thinking about this not just in terms of photochemistry, but in terms of really large scale industrial chemistry, the kind of chemistry that gave us plastics and that gave us weapons and pharmaceuticals. And in the case of this book, things like cigarette filters, which are also a plastic. And it looks at two companies. It looks at the Eastman Kodak Company, which of course was always the world's largest and still is the world's largest manufacturer of film, and the Agfa Company in Germany, which was second to Kodak always throughout its existence. And within Kodak, I focus on the Tennessee Eastman Corporation, which for most of the 20th century was Kodak's main chemical subsidiary, and today is Eastman Chemical, so it's still around. And the book, in looking at these factories or these companies within the context of the chemical industry, tracks them in particular as they intersected with chemical warfare, with poison gas in one sense, and on one hand, and also in the case of Tennessee Eastman and Eastman Kodak with the Manhattan Project, looking at the work that the companies did at Oak Ridge to separate uranium for the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima.
And one of the films that you write about, which I've never seen, is, I'm sure you're expecting, you know exactly which one I'm referring to, is an industrial film, as they used to be called, by Kodak, that is about globalization, 1921 style. So after they've, in a sense, been rescued by the First World War, or certainly stimulated, and it's a fascinating, and you have some stills from it in the book, and a wonderful description. It seems as though this is one of those moments when one realizes that globalization is not something that's in any way recent, that it has a long history that's utterly crucial to these firms.
Absolutely. Yeah, this is a film called A Movie Trip Through Filmland, which was just an industrial made in 1921. And I think not just an industrial, this was also an advertising film that would have been shown to publicize how the great company that, made all the film that people use worked, and the raw materials it used, and how organized it was, and how safe it was. So it shows the film as it's manufactured and then as it travels the globe. And it literally is an animation of a strip of film unfurling around the globe from New York, heading across Europe, across Asia, and then ending up in Los Angeles, where a film is made. And so, yeah, it is a nice way to capture the global reach of a company whose goals were always to be the largest in the world and the most powerful and the most profitable in the world. Because on the one hand, it gets at the circulation, which we can think of in terms of subsidiaries and sales agents and all the other kinds of companies that help sell the film, but also through the subsidiaries that were factories, right? That made the film, that helped gather raw materials and things like that. So it really tracks things from the sites of extraction, well, not really the sites of extraction, but from the materials that are extracted up to the film that's made from them.
And interestingly enough, Congo is a key node in all of this. A century ago, just as it is today, no
Absolutely.
cell phone batteries without Congo, no more or less safe film without Congo a century back. Is that fair to say?
I think the stories are related, but they're parallel. So the story
Uh-huh.
of the Belgian Congo comes in through the case of uranium, which is the uranium that Tennessee Eastman and Eastman Kodak were processing at Oak Ridge. So most of that uranium that went into the first bomb dropped on August 6, 1945 by the United States was from the Belgian Congo, and mined in a very coercive, very, very dangerous context that's echoed, as you say, in the context today in which minerals and metals like cobalt are mined for our cell phones and for our computers, et cetera. So the book tracks this question of safety through the history of safety film, cellulose acetate safety film, which is the material that 16 millimeter was made on and is still made on. It's the material that most film is made on today when it's not made on polyester. And it was an alternative to cellulose nitrate film, which was extremely flammable, is extremely flammable, extremely hard to extinguish. And in cellulose acetate was the material that was made by Tennessee Eastman at their factory in Kingsport, Tennessee. And it was the material that made the company into a huge chemical manufacturer, that made its productions big enough, that made its familiarity with large-scale chemical engineering big enough that Tennessee Eastman was then asked to produce the anti-submarine explosive RDX at a nearby ammunition plant during World War II, and from there to move to Oak Ridge, which was then just being built.
And getting onto the safety issues, I'm sorry I'm darting around historically, but to force the complexity of the story, you do that a little bit in the book yourself, which is not a criticism, it's an observation. There is this spectacular incident in a hospital that you describe in harrowing detail before they get into this nuclear stuff. But when they're dealing with the much more flammable and dangerous form of film, could you talk a bit about that and the impact that it had?
Yeah, absolutely. So this is in 1929, and it's a very well-known event in the United States. Is the Cleveland Clinic disaster, which was still to this day the most fatal hospital disaster in the United States. And it was sparked literally and figuratively by X-ray films that were made on cellulose nitrate that were stored in the basement of the hospital. They ignited because of their proximity with a hot pipe in the basement. And it caused an explosion that killed, I think, over 120 people. And in many cases, these were deaths that resembled the deaths from poison gas during World War I, because the way that film gas works, right, cellulose nitrate film gas works, is very similar to the way that poison gas works on the lungs, which is that, you know, the injuries may not show up immediately, they might show up later, right? So it's particularly insidious in that sense. And it was also something that people were on alert for in the 1920s, right? The First World War wasn't that long before. There had been a great deal of discussion and fear of poison gas, and a sense that this was really, you know, a moral problem, a technological problem, etc. And so film had spent a while at that point, about 5 or 6 years, trying to establish itself as something that could be safe. In the early part of the 20th century, film fires were really common. It was common for film reels to catch on fire. But in the mid-1920s, there was a greater move, at least on Kodak's part, to market a non-flammable film, the cellulose acetate film. So when the Cleveland Clinic disaster happened, it linked up the history of poison gas with the flammability of film, because again, these were nitrate X-ray films that caught on fire. And so it was one of the big impetuses for the company to move more deeply into marketing 16 millimeter, marketing non-flammable film, which by 1951 became the standard for 35 millimeter film as well.
This also makes me think about 1915. It's the year before the US joins the First World War. It's the year that the Supreme Court declares cinema not to be speech, so it doesn't have First Amendment protections from that year until 1952. But it's also one of these moments that occur occasionally until their destruction by Clinton, Bush, and Obama, when the Justice Department gets serious about busting trusts. And historically, lots of people thinking about Hollywood, let's say, or pre-Hollywood cinema in the United States, think about trust busting as having an effect in the 30s and then just after the war. But what you talk about is a much earlier trust busting, and it's not about vertical integration by the studios. It's about Kodak, whose response is, ironically, in part vertical integration, as well as getting into bed with the government. Now, I've just given what is probably an inaccurate adumbration, but could you fill in the story and correct it where I got it wrong, please, Prof?
Absolutely. Yeah, so Kodak was always very clear about its ambitions to become the best and the largest, right? So I mentioned that already. And in the early 20th century, it spent a lot of time buying competitors. So buying camera firms, buying film firms, really becoming something like a trust. And it was seen as such very clearly within the United States and abroad, especially by its competitors, companies like AGFA and Pathé. And so the Justice Department began an investigation of Kodak, especially after its involvement with the Motion Picture Patents Company, MP, yes, I always get that acronym somewhat wrong, but through what was called the trust in the early 20th century in the film industry, the exhibitors, the film manufacturers, the studios, et cetera. And it began an investigation during the war. The investigation kind of dragged on during the war because there were other things for the Department of Justice to do. Kodak, in the meantime, started more manufacturing on a very large scale for the United States because German chemicals had been sort of cut off. So they began making organic chemicals and also making weatherproof airplane coatings, things like that. And then in 1920, 1921, when the war was over, there was a consent decree finally, where Kodak was mandated by the Department of Justice to sell its stake and its competitors, stop buying competitors, and to basically stop expanding in the photographic field. And so their response, the company's response to this was to vertically integrate. So instead of buying camera companies, to buy companies that made the raw materials that it needed to make its film and to make its cameras. And so this is how we end up with Tennessee Eastman in Kingsport, Tennessee, which was surrounded by forests, was in a context I discussed in the book of the New South, where there was this interest in marketing Appalachia and the South for its raw materials, for its cheap labor, for its lack of unions. And so the company built a methanol factory initially in Kingsport, which then grew into something much larger.
And this again has resonances a century later, doesn't it, with some of the poorer post-industrial states of the US offering incredible boondoggles to these people to generate server farms, to build server farms.
Absolutely. And I think that's one of the big takeaways from the book is that tout ça change, right? It's a lot of the same story, really, with media, whether it's analog or digital, and that we can't really think that we're living in an era or that is all that different from the past, or we can't really think of the past as this moment free of these really complex questions.
And that leads me to ask if we could turn for a moment to the present in terms of Kodak. Just about 2 or 3 weeks ago, CNN reported it's bust. It doesn't exist anymore. Now, this must have been reported dozens of times in the last 20 years, I imagine, and there are immediate ripostes from Kodak saying, no, no, no. So that leads me to the question of how and then we might get on to AGFA if that's okay, how Kodak has sought to respond or be part of technological change over the last, especially, I guess, 40 years.
That's a great question. And, I don't cover its sort of failed transition to digital in the book, which I think is the big part of this story, especially over the past 40 years, which was the sort of very deep involvement it had in digital questions, but the failure to really engage with what digital imaging would look like. And so that is, I think, one of the big questions. But I look at these earlier periods of technological change that that Kodak was part of, and I think safety is one of these. And this question of safety is something that I think we can track through multiple tentacles, both in the company's history and in the history of film manufacturing more generally, because I think that's another one of the big stories that the book is interested in telling is that this isn't an American story only, right? It's not just a story of American empire. It's a story of the ways in which different imperial projects were caught up with one another, whether those were empires in terms of states and their extractive work, or in terms of business empires that were closely caught up with those questions as well.
So, off to Germany. AGFA. What are some of the similarities and differences between the militant chemistry of AGFA by contrast with Kodak?
I think we have to start with the differences in the kind of corporate diversification strategies that got the companies to where they are. So they're both chemical companies. Kodak ended up in plastics and in weapons and in all these other things that it made through film. So it started off making film and then it realized, okay, we can diversify into these other things. When we buy the methanol factory, we can diversify into cellulose acetate, and then we can diversify into other kinds of plastics. And those plastics can be made into different things like rayon. In Agfa's case, it started out as a dye manufacturer. And Germany's dye industry was the most prestigious, the largest, the most developed in the world in the 19th century. And so it moved from dye making to photochemical manufacturing because photochemistry relies on dyes, and that's how the film gets sensitized to light. And so when we think about that trajectory, we go to, for instance, poison gas in a different way, because the same organic chemicals that are used to make dyes, or some of the same organic chemicals, are also used and that are used to make photographic products were used to make poison gas during the war. And this is, again, a question of when the markets stopped during the war, at least when circulation between Germany and the rest of the world stopped. You had all these surpluses, and the chemical surpluses were used in some cases to make gas. And so that is a connection that's there. And in Agfa's case, they were bottling gas in one of their factories in Berlin. And something that has struck me in this research, especially looking at Pathé, the company in France that was also a major film manufacturer and which did manufacture poison gas, is that the reason these companies made poison gas or bottled poison gas was that they had the infrastructure to do so. And the infrastructure was well ventilated, right? It was designed to prevent worker injuries at the film factory by bringing in enough air and taking the air out so the nitric acid wouldn't be dangerous. But that same infrastructure was used to make the deadliest weapons the war had seen.
Wow, it's quite a story. And I am old enough to remember when the consumer of everyday still taking, as it were, had a choice in the United States of Agfa and Kodak. When Agfa had clambered into the US market latterly, and like VW had lost its Nazi connotations, like some of the German scientists that the US happily pilfered after the war. And there's something fascinating here. It's quite Orwellian, I think, the way in which former enemies can become spirited collaborators. By collaborators, I don't mean in the political sense, I mean, can be competitors, but legitimate. And everybody's complicity with war is airbrushed from history and popular knowledge.
Yeah, and I think that's partly because those histories are so pervasive, right? Those histories, especially when you track corporate history back through its subsidiaries, back through histories of diversification, um, war is a big industry in Germany, big industry in the United States, big industry elsewhere in the world, and film is chemical. And war is chemical, and it's a very, very everyday story. And that's one of the things that I find the most actually concerning about this project is that it is so, in a way, predictable in terms of the histories of manufacturing and the chemical industry and industrial capitalism.
But also, I guess, the development of recording technology. So many important stimuli happen in terms of this during the Vietnam War. It's the first available jet airliner that can take undeveloped film from Vietnam to Singapore to get it developed and then shipped back to New York for showing 10 days after it's shot by Walter Cronkite or whoever. In the Second World War, it's massively improved recording capacity of cameras that helps then to become important in direct cinema, cinema verite, etc. Right?
Absolutely.
And I guess Paul Virilio is perhaps one of the guys that gets associated with this in terms of media technologies and war. And now we have your book It really is a tour de force. But given that there are these prehistories, as it were, can you tell us what turned you on to this in the first place, Prof? What got Alice Lovejoy from Austrian studies, Czechoslovak military cinema, comparative literature, to going in amongst the detail in Eastman House and elsewhere?
Yeah, so my first book you've just pointed at is a history of an experimental film culture that emerged in the Czechoslovak army in the post-war period, which is it's a very historical project as well. A lot of archival work, a lot of paper archival work, government documents, budgets, et cetera, as well as working with films. And so I've always been interested in this question of the odd sites where media history unfolds. And those sites may be, a very well-funded military film studio in a small socialist state, or it may be the chemical industry. And but there is throughout an interest also in the intersection between military cultures and militarized cultures and media and film in particular. And so I had finished that project, or was finishing that project, and was thinking about the World War II period, and particularly about the shortage in film stock in those years, which was a huge deal. It's a huge deal for paper as well. It was a huge deal for materials for, basically every medium, especially in the UK. I was working on London during these years and thinking about the film stock shortage, and came across a mention of Kodak's work for the Manhattan Project, which underscored the degree to which the shortage in film really had to do with these companies making things that had very little to do with what they did in their sort of civilian existence. And so that was in a shareholder report, actually. So this is not a hidden history. It was sort of something that was shared pretty publicly. And so I followed that back through some other documents and realized, okay, there's a story here. And there's a story that that isn't, again, just about the US, because I think that's something that we have to really resist, is the impulse to narrate things only from the US perspective in our field, in particular in media studies. I think these are global stories. And so the project after that was really tracking this both on the US level, which is working in multiple archives that had nothing to do with media, right? Archives that were in various places, various collecting missions, and then doing the same in the German case and in other countries as well.
And
but yeah, nothing Czech here.
I
Just
guess
a little bit.
in terms of being surprised, perhaps a big surprise was that moment when you read the shareholder report and learned about the Manhattan Project involved.
Yes. Yeah.
Were there other surprises along the way? One of the benefits of working in archives is that after what can be hours, weeks, months of finding nothing, suddenly there's a nugget, as it were, that you strike.
Yes. I think there were a number. Some of them had to do with the people in the book, the characters that the book follows, and trying to see if I was interested in seeing if I could figure out what their stories were and what their lives were like, and what brought them to work in these factories and what it was like to work in the factories, because that's part of the story that I think can get overlooked somewhat. The question of what the actual labor was, and so I was able to track down the story of a Ukrainian forced laborer in Agfa's factory in Vodvin. She was an active member of the Communist Party in Dnipro in Ukraine. She was deported to Germany. She was selected to work in the film factory and the rayon factory. And I was able to track down, much of her story through oral history, through archives at Buchenwald. And I think that was when you bring in those levels of personal experience and familial experience and emotion and all these sort of smaller details that make up the story of a factory, it adds a great deal, I think, to these kinds of stories and to what we understand media to be, and how we understand it to work.
And you mentioned that she's a communist activist. Where do issues of gender and of political affiliation come into play here? There are some wonderful stories you tell about a certain kind of Southern masculinity, white Southern masculinity, but it's meant to be the New South, for example. So could you perhaps reflect a little bit on that, both in the context of being a Ukrainian communist and in the context of being a good old boy who's trying not to be so old.
Yeah. So the gender question, I mean, there on the one hand, there's a long history of work in film factories being a gendered, there being gender dimensions to that work, which other scholars have talked about. Women working in particular in film factories because it was seen as kind of fine-grained work. And also working in textile factories. So that's part of the story that spans Germany and the New South and Tennessee, the textile question, and specifically the question of rayon. So one of the reasons that Tennessee Eastman was able to grow in the really huge way it did, I mean, it became the most profitable arm of Eastman Kodak during the Great Depression because of rayon, right? Because rayon fibers were taking off in part because, it was seen as a better textile for clothing, and in part because it was cheaper to make things in a laboratory than it was to import silk and wool and cotton. Well, you weren't importing cotton, but silk and wool, things like that. And this was labor that was done, in large part by women because they were seen as having the dexterity to operate the wheels and the spindles and the things that made rayon. And this is of course linked to histories of women in the textile industry in having to do with cotton, the northern textile mills, et cetera. So there's a longer history that this is part of. And in Wolfen as well, with AGFA, you had a similar kind of linkage between women's labor and the viscose rayon that was being made in that factory. Specifically, there was an agreement between the film factory, the AGFA film factory, and the Ravensbrück concentration camp, the women's concentration camp. And the idea was that women could do this work. They sort of just knew how to do it. So I trace this over in a sense to, in one sense, to Y12 at Oak Ridge, where famously the Calutrons at Y12, the Tennessee Eastman factory, were operated by women who were, again, seen as very attentive to detail, very good at noticing when a gauge had to be turned, very good at modulating how they turned it. And these were, in many cases, women who had come from the textile industry nearby because rayon and cotton before it were such major parts of the Southern economy in the 20s and 30s. But then you've also mentioned the male, the sort of the ways in which this built on a kind of masculinist culture, white culture in the U.S. South and in Appalachia. So George Eastman and my distant relative, Frank Lovejoy, decided to build the factory in Tennessee, in part because there was this sense that there was available white labor. I think in many cases, particularly male labor, right? Because the question is, okay, so we're in the New South economy when we're moving from an agricultural to an industrial basis, that there were, people who needed to be put to work, and this was one way to do it. So I track a couple of figures in Kingsport, Tennessee, who were, on the one hand, local and trying to bring northern businesses south, and on the other hand, people from the north, industrialists from the north, who were trying to publicize these resources and these laborers to their colleagues up north and bring them down.
One of the documents you quote from at one point, as I recall, about cotton and its importance refers to plantation style cotton or some such expressions. So that inevitably brings up the question of the situation of Black labor during all of this. And there are one or two stories of so-called beneficent white men wanting to improve the morality, in inverted commas, but also the material lives of Black people. Could you maybe comment a wee bit on that?
Yeah, so I'm sure many of your audience know this, but film the cotton that is used to make film is the cotton linter. So it's the little fibers that attach to the cotton seed, and that's what goes into nitrocellulose. It goes into other kinds of cellulose for film. So it's central to making film. And this had been grown in the U.S. South. That was the largest place in which it was grown, and it was exported all over the world. So I focus on the one hand, there's a small mention of this in the book because that was one of the reasons that Kodak decided to build Tennessee Eastman, was because they knew that cotton was not far away, right? The markets were not far away. You could get one of those raw materials easily. It didn't have to travel very far. You were sort of hooked in with that network already. But I also follow a smaller story about George Eastman, Kodak's founder himself, who had a kind of gentleman's farm in North Carolina, you know, not terribly close, but not terribly far from Tennessee, where he employed, in some cases, formerly enslaved people and their children to grow cotton as a cash crop. And Eastman's work here was complicated. I mean, he was an abolitionist. He was, or not an abolitionist, but he was involved in sort of abolitionist thought. He sort of um, came from that line of thinking in a New England, upstate New York context, and had a very, I think, sincere interest in improving the people who worked for him wherever they were, whether they were in his factories or on his farms. But it's extremely paternalistic and racist. And it was work that, I see as a kind of, or I discussed in the book as an echo between how Tennessee Eastman was thinking about trees and white labor, that there were some echoes between how Eastman personally thought about cotton and black labor.
Wow. There's just so much that's so rich in all of this. I wondered if we could move now to my asking you a couple of final questions and then giving you the opportunity to add anything you may wish. That could take the form of something we've not discussed at all that you want to introduce, or it might be revisiting something that we have mentioned. Does that sound okay as a way of bringing things to a close?
It does. Thank you.
So my first question is, this is a massively interdisciplinary project, drawing on a huge array of forms of knowledge. How did you re-educate yourself to be able to do this? Or did you grow up with this coursing through your intellectual veins?
That's a great question. And I think, so I was, my PhD is in film studies and comparative literature, but I have an interdisciplinary bachelor's degree in documentary studies, and worked as a film critic before I went back to graduate school. And so I think that there is something of, um, I would say, a sort of a documentary perspective here of following the threads where they go. And if the threads go different places, you follow them there. And if the threads go to different disciplines, you follow them there. I think there is a risk in this kind of interdisciplinary work of never being an expert in everything, or it being impossible to be an expert in everything. And I think that's true for all of us. But knowing enough to be able to see the project in a kind of global framework, a limited global framework, because there are many other stories that one could tell unfolding in Japan with Fuji, unfolding in subsidiaries in different parts of the US, different parts of the world. But to try to grasp those disciplinary threads, those stories, those personal stories, those industrial stories, those material stories within that framework, in the container of a book that people who may not be familiar with film might still be able to read. And so that was, I think, the challenge was finding a way to do all of that. And there's a lot more work to be done, but that's the beauty of the kind of work we do, right? That other people can take up parts of it.
Speaking of lots of work to be done, my last question to you is, what's on the docket? What are you thinking about for the future? Or are you taking a deep breath and looking at your plum tree?
Yeah. Well, the plum tree is not going to be giving us plums for much longer, maybe another week or two. But no, I'm interested in these questions of format and the materials in format and the local and global geopolitical questions that raises. And then my next project will probably be looking at this through the lens of video. So that's where I'm going next, through tape. So that is very much in its beginning stages. So that's all I can say about it for the moment. But I'm interested in the similar kinds of questions that I've asked in this project, and thinking about how, how corporations conceive of technologies and how technologies are conceived of by their users, by their viewers, and what this means in terms of communities and places.
University of California Press. Sign this gal up. So, Prof. Lovejoy, I've learned so much from this book. It's wonderfully detailed, brilliantly descriptive, extraordinarily analytical. Tales of Militant Chemistry, The Film Factory in a Century of War is amazing. It's also quite gripping, actually, in the way
Thank you.
it's plotted. So I just loved it. And as I say, I learned a huge amount. What have we not touched on that you'd like to add now? Or what have we discussed that you'd like to track back to and comment on again?
Well, I think one of the parts of the story that a chapter that is in the middle of the book and that you've talked a little bit about that but we haven't discussed here, but because a lot of media studies people listen to you and watch you, I will take the opportunity to talk about it. There's a chapter in the book that thinks about what happened to the the AGFA factory after World War II when it was investigated by the Allied armies, the Western Allies, and by the Soviet Union, and how this became a moment when film's materials sort of collapsed. Their traditional meanings kind of started to collapse. So there are some wonderful archival documents about a meeting between an AGFA film factory executive and a US officer trained in the kind of progressive approaches of management, a former city manager from the US, who was very upset that this AGFA factory manager wanted to move some gelatin between zones of occupation. And he couldn't really understand why they wanted the gelatin. He couldn't understand why they wanted to move silver for the same reason, because of course silver is money. It's something that you use for exchange. It's not something that we use to make film. And I think those moments of what seem like misunderstandings, but are actually these sort of moments of disciplinary encounter, right? Or professional encounter in it are really useful to think about when we think about our work outside disciplinary boundaries. Or sort of going back to your question of interdisciplinarity, I found that a very productive thing to think about because, of course, gelatin is not just for making film emulsion. It's also, this is something I discussed in the book, for making yogurt and for making ice cream and for making glue. There are a lot of uses for it. But I think media studies, of course, disciplines do their things, and that there's a tendency to look at it within one lens. But when you start to open up those industrial perspectives, so much more becomes visible. And I think the politics and the geopolitics of the materials and the media become visible in new ways. So that's one of the things that interested me in the process of researching and writing this.
That's a wonderful way to conclude things, to think about, as you said, professional differences and disciplinary differences and points of similarity and social forces that you've evoked
Yes.
so wonderfully with reference to gender, to race, to geopolitics in the book and also in your comments today. So I thank you very deeply for doing this. And I think, as I said, it's a wonderful, wonderful book.
Thank you so much for having me. It's been a wonderful conversation and I really appreciate it.